Good morning, Middle.
Good morning.
Oh, good morning, Middle. There you go. There you go. You had the 9:30 service as a precedent for enthusiasm, so I'm just laying that out there. Just laying that out there. So my name is David Kim, and as Rob so graciously introduced me, I'm so blessed and honored to be here at Middle. What a wonderful, wondrous church you have. You know, I have often introduced folks to Middle saying that this is the premier social justice, multiracial, multicultural church of New York City, if not the United States of America. You are a beacon in these odd and strange and difficult times. And you will continue to be a beacon because this is a love-saturated church. It is a love-saturated church, and you are a love-saturated people. I can feel that every time I come here. If I lived in New York City, I would come here all the time. I want to thank Reverend Jackie Lewis for the invitation to speak here today. Jackie, I believe, as Rob told me, is in Australia. Hi, Jackie. You know, and I said earlier that, you know, Jackie's genuinely a global preacher, right? She brings the word of justice, she brings the word of love everywhere in her presence and in her service. I also want to thank Rob, he is a tremendously gifted pastor as well. I mean, you know Rob here at Middle. I knew him as a student at Union. I did not fully appreciate who he is as a national activist, working with the Moral Mondays movement and our dear friend and brother, Reverend William Barber, and the Poor People's Campaign. And Rob just told me that he's going to be organizing the Moral Mondays movement for Poor People's Campaign coming up, right? Right? Because he needs more work. I also want to appreciate Marta, what she does with the children and gospel choir. And the band. And the band. And the band. If you're wondering if the Holy Spirit is here in this church, just listen and watch the gospel choir and the band. And John. Where's John? I could watch John on loop, video loop. The way he moves, the way the Spirit courses through him, it brings me such joy and pleasure. And it brings me such joy and pleasure to be here as to help you kick off Asian Pacific American History and Heritage Month, or as we say in my household, every month. We like having, you know, May, but we like every month, too. You know, it's okay, it's always somebody. It's always somebody. You know, I come to you today with a message called When Love is No Longer Strange. When love is no longer strange. You know, we hear a lot of talk of love, and we hear it repeatedly in the liturgy and the services here at Middle. But often I wonder about how well we understand that love. And that wonderful song that you just sang of Kirk Franklin. You know, the mystery of love that comes down to us, that we do not fully understand. You know, I come to you as a Christian and as a Confucian, which means that I have been forged the traditions of love and the traditions of ethics. And those traditions of love are not always fully clear and transparent. You know, when I talk about love, I'm talking about the love of compassion, the love of generosity, the love of forgiveness, and the love of mercy, where mercy means bending our hearts towards suffering from a God who gives us that mercy freely. I'm a fool for that mercy and love, because I have been saved more times than I can remember. And we talked about, in the Lord's Prayer, we talk about trespasses and sins. But I am one of those cracked vessels for whom I will always be seeking an abiding love for the sinfulness that is in me. Now, I say this because, not to make you feel bad, but I say this because it's important to have a kind of candor about why we worship, a candor about why we come together around the messages of love. And I mentioned my Confucian constitution because I am who I am because of the deep ethical relationships in my life, which is also to say I am who I am because somebody loved me, which is also to say that somebody keeps on loving me. I am the child of Charles and Anne. I am the father of Noah and Josiah. I'm born of certain communities. And out of those communities, out of that family, out of those relationships, I learned that I was worthy of love. But it turns out that wasn't even enough. So when I think about the Gospels, I think about the message of loving friendship that we heard in the Gospel of John today. That someone loved us so that we can love. Someone sacrificed himself so that we can love. So, in talking about Asian Pacific American Month, really, I want to talk about the love that is called sacrifice. The love that is called sacrifice. For the word freaks in you, the word sacrifice comes from two words, saker and fakere, which means to make holy. To make holy. I come to the United States as an immigrant, the beneficiary of the sacrifices of those who came before me. I am a direct beneficiary of the 1965 Immigration and Naturalization Act, the third pillar Civil Rights Act of the mid-60s, which is to say that I am the beneficiary of the sacrifices of the freedom fighters that made that happen. So we can talk about Asian Pacific American Month, but we also can talk about the ways in which we in Asian America are indebted to African Americans. We are indebted to the freedom fighters, Native Americans, and Latino Americans. It's not sufficient just to talk about one peoples and populations. We have to talk about our interconnectedness and the ways in which we need each other and that we have sacrificed for each other and we continue to make each other holy through those sacrifices. Asian Americans have a peculiar place and role in the American experiment. We're often used as proxies in what we might call the white supremacist racial order. In the prayer earlier was mentioned the Chinese Exclusion Act, which was a way of bringing in labor but also excluding the proliferation of families, the anti-miscegenation laws, or the internment of the Japanese in World War II, which was the dark precedent for hopefully no more internments. But you hear those echoes directly affecting my family, my heritage is the Korean War, and of course, in terms of proxy, if you think about the American imagination around warfare, it's Vietnam. So that the inimical other of the American war state was forged in the 60s and 70s by this idea that the Vietnamese were the enemy that had turned our nation inside out and upside down. And even in this moment, Asian Americans are serving as proxies in other nefarious ways. I am someone who considers himself part of the freedom traditions, the radical love traditions. And it troubles me when I see conservative Asian Americans siding, for example, in the lawsuits against affirmative action. This is a troubling affair. This is a troubling affair. They're not siding with justice, they're siding with that old American habit of self-interest. Where are my children going to get in? My child did not get into Harvard. They only got into Yale. Give me a break. I mention the indebtedness to those who came before us because if you really appreciate that, if you really understand it, you really come with a grateful and loving heart for that history, you would never put forward that expression of self-interest because we know that the barriers of access to education are exceedingly high. And again, so the Asian Americans, my peoples, have served as a proxy for injustice in that instance. And so we come to speak the hard words, the necessary words of radical love. The hard words, the necessary words of a sacrificial love, which is to make oneself holy and another holy. I've been thinking a lot about my family history in these days. As you know, there was that surprising meeting at the 38th parallel recently. And for those of you who don't know, the premier of North Korea, Kim Jong-un, met with the president of South Korea, President Moon. And in a series of remarkable symbolic engagements, cross borders. I should say I was there in Korea for the first time since I was born this past September. Yeah. And in many ways, it was difficult to come back. I left as a baby, but because the memories are so hard for my family, that it was hard for me to find the spirit to find my way back there. And it wasn't until my son Noah decided to study there for this fall semester that I felt licensed to go, permission to go. So in that sense, it's not just an elder, but a younger person that gifted that grace to me. And I mentioned the crossing because when I was there, I think in my mind as a child, I always thought of the 38th parallel as a little line, right? It's a little line, right, that separates the North from the South. And as you make your way from Seoul to the demilitarized zone, you realize it's a wretched expanse. And then I started thinking about my mother's family that made their way from North Korea to South Korea, across that wretched expanse, and my heart just broke apart. Recently, my parents have started telling me, they're in their early 80s, and started telling me stories about the war. And my mother told me that, as you know, in the Korean War was initiated by, or so we're told, an invasion from the north to the south. The understanding of geopolitics at the time in the city of Seoul was under a tight regime. So my mother said, we were in middle school. The principal shows up and makes an announcement. We have to leave because the North Koreans have invaded. And 2 days later, she and her parents are refugees because they're from the north. And they were already in Seoul at that time and then had to make their way literally on foot the entirety of the peninsula to the south. Twice. And I said, why did you have to run? You were Korean. And she said, because we had North Korean accents. We had North Korean accents. So we knew people would seek us out. So we have this idea that peoples are people, and yet we turn on each other swiftly and quickly with an alacrity that is troubling. And so, somewhat troubling to my parents, I ended up writing a public document this past fall. Because I sort of want to take credit for the summit. So, you're welcome. So I co-wrote a letter to the New York Times with my colleague George Yancey from Emory University. And we titled the letter, A Letter of Love to Kim Jong-un, the president of North Korea. Exactly. So I'm going to read you a little bit of that letter because, as you remember, there was a lot of, as the media likes to say, saber rattling from our president regarding North Korea. Again, using North Korea as a proxy, using Asians as a proxy to cover all the troubles here, to stoke a potential war that would cover a host of sins, he hoped, here. So George and I wrote this letter, and I'm going to read you some passages from it just to give you a sense of the call to love that we were hoping that Kim Jong-un could hear. So we write to you as two American citizens, an African American and a Korean American, considered men of color in our country, who have suffered with our people under the history of America's white racist violence, yet who still dare to love. Just as we have faith in our fragile and imperfect American democratic experiment, we have faith that you believe in something far more courageous than words of war. Our aim is to meet you in the spirit of a resolute conviction that you are a human being who is worthy of being loved by us, and that we are human beings worthy of being loved by you. It is quite simple, really, and yet so hard for so many to see that we, North Koreans and Americans, are brothers and sisters. That straightforward yet existentially urgent statement is what is necessary during this time of crisis between our nations. These feel like especially loveless times. We write from the conviction that the values of a love-driven politics can transform how we engage each other, not only as nations, but also as human beings, which is to say, a love-driven politics insists that we seek compassion, generosity, kindness, forgiveness, and mercy for each other as much as we do for ourselves. Whoops. As a Korean American, I have to acknowledge you both as one of my people, and very much not of my people. My mother's family is from North Korea, and so in some very real ways, you and I are of common stock. But land does not make for a family. If anything, you and your father have shown how land and nation can destroy families and traumatize them for generations. You are a leader of a nation whose people have suffered at the service of a political vision. At what cost has your loyalty to power come to your people, let alone to your humanity? And of course, we could have addressed this to our president as well. My mother's family fled North Korea because of the forces of war that are all too similar to the enmities that are threatening us today. And it was the consequences of the Korean War and the havoc it wreaked on my people in South Korea that eventually drove my family to the United States. And through this migration and growing up in white supremacist America, I was transformed from our common stock to a Korean American dedicated to the ways of love. Indeed, as a Korean brother, I have been forged by my inheritance from Christianity and Confucianism. This means that my witness to you is born of traditions of love and ethical responsibility. Among the very real and central challenges of radical love is to adhere to the moral mandate to love our neighbors and enemies as we would love ourselves, as we heard in the gospel this morning. This is especially challenging at a moment in which love has been hard to find and discern for those of us who lament the ascendancy of our current president. We have had to learn how to love ourselves once again. So we reach out to you from the beloved community that holds the values of speaking truth to power with love. This is a calling. It is our vocation. We have no choice but to strive to live up to the grand examples of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, of activists like Fannie Lou Hamer, and my personal hero, the great Grace Lee Boggs. These heroic figures have been exceptions to the insidious rule of an American legacy of white supremacy and imperialism that has left the least amongst us in utter despair. This tradition of radical love is an American tradition, even though it has drawn deeply and powerfully from people like Gandhi and Thich Nhat Hanh. So we come to you as citizens of an America not yet fully realized. Thy kingdom come. One that insists on the ways of love can be the ways of democracy. That the challenge of loving one's neighbor and enemies is fundamentally a call for freedom and justice and hope. We write to you with love and an appeal for forgiveness and mercy, because history and our lot demand this of us, and our hope is that it will demand the same of our fellow citizens, with peace and love. David and George. Now, I can't tell you that our letter convinced Kim Jong-un to show up at the 38th parallel last week, but I'd like to believe it. I can't tell you that the message of radical love has softened our president to meet with the premier of North Korea, but I'd like to believe it. Because we have to believe in this power of radical love. You know, Rob mentioned the course that Cornell West and I taught on radical love, and one of the working definitions we have of radical love is that it's to learn how to die in order for something to live. So the message of sacrifice is a message of radical love. Now, you know, growing up, the message of sacrifice in an Asian American household was guilt. You know what I did for you? You know what I sacrificed for you? Or my father's favorite one. You know we were war refugees, right? And I'd be like, okay, I'll mow the lawn, I'll pick up my sister, I'll study harder. And it took me a long time to transform and transmute that mannered practice of sacrifice as guilt to understanding that sacrifice was about love. That they did for me because someone did for them. And they would hope that I would do for others. They loved me. They made me holy through their sacrifice with the hope that I would do the same. You know, I come to you as a teacher, not as a preacher, but as a teacher that seeks to instill this message of radical love, of the sacrifice of love, with the hope that we can change our culture. We can turn the hearts of the culture away from rapacious self-interest, away from the pursuit of money, away from the pursuit of power, and again, to bend our hearts towards suffering. But that requires sacrificing ourselves. As Jesus said, there's no greater love than one who is ready to lay one's life down for a friend. What are we going to give up in order to love well and love fully? In order to live well and love well? I mean, that is the message of justice, but that's also the message of freedom and hope. I would be remiss in not mentioning the passing of a giant, Dr. James Cone. The funeral service for him will take place tomorrow morning at Riverside Church, and I mention James Cone, this grand articulator and architect of liberation theology, because he was the one who voiced the possibility that theology did not have to speak for the most powerful, but it could speak for the rest of us. That the cross, in the American context, could only be understood next to the lynching tree. That freedom meant nothing and means nothing if it were not freedom for black folks and brown folks and all the rest of us. In the passing of a giant like that, who made space for so many of us, we understand that as a sacrifice. And so we can talk about liberation, we can talk about justice, we talk about sacrifice. But my message to you really is to be the sacrifice, to be the love, to find ourselves in that mode of making holy. You know, I often talk to my students about these 3 key words, and I'll leave you with them as well before I read a closing poem. confidence, courage, and comfort. The root of the word confidence, cum fides, means to come with faith. Courage finds its root in the word heart, cur. And comfort, cum forte, means to come with strength. To come with strength. Imagine a culture that insisted that we come to every context, come to meet suffering with faith, with heart, and with strength. We don't have to imagine because we can live it. We don't have to imagine it because it has been done for us. So I come to you again as someone who has been gifted with those legacies of comfort and courage and confidence. And I'm going to close with this beautiful poem by the Chinese-American poet Wang Ping. It's called Things We Carry on the Sea. We carry tears in our eyes. Goodbye, Father. Goodbye, Mother. We carry soil in small bags. May home never fade in our hearts. We carry names, stories, memories of our villages, fields, boats. We carry scars from proxy wars of greed. We carry carnage of mining, droughts, floods, genocides. We carry dust of our families and neighbors incinerated in mushroom clouds. We carry our islands sinking under the sea. We carry our hands, feet, bones, hearts, and best minds for a new life. We carry diplomas, medicine, engineer, nurse, education, math, poetry, even if they mean nothing to the other shore. We carry railroads, plantations, laundromats, bodegas, taco trucks, farms, factories, nursing homes, hospitals, schools, temples, built on our ancestors' backs. We carry old homes along the spine, new dreams in our chests. We carry yesterday, today, and tomorrow. We're orphans of the wars forced upon us. We're refugees of the sea rising from industrial wastes. And we carry our mother tongues. I, hub, lieb, amor, love, pingan, salam, shalom, paz, peace, zuwang, amal, Hoffnung, Esperanza, hope, 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 as we drift in our rubber boats from shore to shore to shore. We carry the sacrificial love inside of us, even if we don't recognize it. We carry the gifts of grace in us as we should recognize it. So I send you now to consider how we might be the love that carries ourselves with courage, confidence, and comfort. Amen.